Hello and welcome to the latest installment of PSG Talking. I'm your host Ed, and on today's show we're talking all about PSG transfer rumors, and we'll touch on the opening matches of the Euros. Before we get started, let me remind you to subscribe to this show wherever you get your podcasts and leave a review if you listen on Apple Podcasts. Check out PSG Talk Extra Time over on Substack for premium PSG content, and as always, head over to psgtalk.com for all your Paris Saint-Germain news. All right, and joining me today for the first time is Robin Bairner. He's the chief editor at Football Transfers, and he recently joined PSG Talk as a columnist. You can read his work over at PSG Talk Extra Time on Substack. Robin, we're thrilled to have you on. How are things on your end? Are you enjoying the Euro so far?
Yeah, I mean, first up, thanks for having me. It's great to be here and great to join the team, and I'm really looking forward to getting involved in the podcasts and obviously on the columns. And yeah, the Euros have just been absolutely thrilling. We were just discussing off air there the Croatia-Albania match, which has just finished, and it was just an absolutely breakneck match. It was super exciting, and let's hope we get lots more of that this summer.
Yeah, we've had a lot of goals, exciting games. We've had broken noses. It's a lot of talking points with the Euros. So we'll touch on that a little bit towards the end. But I wanted to start with transfer rumors because there's been quite a few involving PSG, and you kind of have your ear to the ground on what's going on. So I wanted to get your opinion on everything. So let's start with Napoli's Kvaratskhelia. What's going on with that situation? I saw that he's got some family members that said he wants to leave Napoli. His agent has backed that up and said he wants to leave. He wants Champions League football. Do you think he leaves Napoli this summer? And do you think there's maybe a Premier League club that could kind of swoop in and take him from PSG?
Yeah, so the situation with Kvaratskhelia is really quite crazy. I mean, as you mentioned, the parent and agent have been getting involved here. And during that interview, they actually admitted they hadn't spoken to Khvicha, which is a really unusual situation here because they're effectively saying that he's up for sale, but he's not said anything. He doesn't know about this by all accounts. So it's a strange situation he finds himself in. And as you say, that they have very much mitigated. They want him to be playing Champions League football next year. They have said that if he doesn't play Champions League football next season, that they will see it as a missed year in his career, effectively, which is quite a big statement to come out and say. But Napoli were very quick to respond to this. It took them a matter of hours. And even though it was quite late at night in Italy, they came out and said immediately that he's not for sale. Now, Napoli's stance is a little bit awkward because they're probably going to have to sell one of their big names this summer, whether that's Osimhen or Kvaratskhelia. It's not certain. You would think it's probably got to be Osimhen that they sell, purely because he's on a huge contract. But equally, as we've seen with PSG already this summer, they're holding out for this minimum fee release clause that he's got in his deal, which is worth around 120 million, we believe. And that's obviously a huge amount of money for to be paying on anybody. It seems that nobody's willing to spend this money, so it's almost a battle of brinkmanship here between Napoli and the clubs who wish to sign him, whether they come out and spend this money. Now, Kvaratskhelia doesn't have this sort of deal at the moment. Napoli want to give him a new contract to effectively put him in the position that Osimhen's in currently. So it's a complicated one because Napoli have more power over Kvaratskhelia than Osimhen. In terms of a Premier League team, who might come out and sign him, just by a process of elimination, we've already mentioned that the Champions League is going to be a factor. That probably means that Manchester United and Chelsea, who are obviously two of the most financially powerful teams in the league, aren't going to be able to sign him. You look at Arsenal, they probably want somebody who's maybe a little bit more versatile. Besides, they've also got other priorities, particularly as a centre-forward. We know they want a goal-scoring centre-forward, perhaps like Osimhen, which kind of leaves Manchester City as the one club that could realistically sign Kvaratskhelia. He's already been linked with Manchester City. Obviously, City do have options in the wing, Jack Grealish and Jeremy Doku, but they could equally sell one of these guys pretty easily. We've seen Pep Guardiola take players in and move them on very quickly. I'm thinking of a Calvin Phillips, for example, or a Matheus Nunes. And Doku could find himself out of the team. And equally, there's no certainty about Grealish's situation. So I think for certain that if there's a club in England that's going to sign Kvaratskhelia, it's going to be Manchester City.
And just one more kind of follow-up question to that. One thing as a PSG supporter, we always hear that, the club PSG, they sort of hang on to players. They call it, prison Saint-Germain and all of that. And then here you have Napoli sort of doing the same thing that PSG are oftentimes accused of, but they don't get the same criticism. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? I just find it an interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Napoli aren't seen as the sort of bad boys of European football to the same extent that PSG are, because they've not come in and spent the same sort of money. So it's, yeah, I mean, they certainly get a little bit more leeway than PSG do. But like you say, it's a very sort of similar situation. PSG have probably got that little bit more financial power that allows them that muscle to keep players like Kylian Mbappé, for example, that little bit longer than they otherwise might have. But for sure, it's a very similar situation, and we've seen other clubs like perhaps Tottenham. I'm thinking with Harry Kane rejecting big money to keep star players there. So it definitely happens. It's not just a PSG phenomenon.
Let's switch gears over to, you mentioned Manchester City as a potential landing spot. They've got a player that I'm kind of scratching my head why they would part ways with him, but Julian Alvarez, I guess he's just not getting the playing time that he would want. Is that the reason why they're looking to move off of him? And we know PSG are heavily linked with him, if not the favorites. Similar question. Is there another club, maybe in the Premier League, who could see this as an opportunity to maybe keep him in the Premier League? Maybe an Arsenal, for example.
Yeah, I mean, I think City's stance here is that they don't want to lose Julian Alvarez. He's obviously a huge player for them, and somebody that they see could be a potential star in the future. So he's not somebody who's necessarily up for sale by Manchester City. It seems to be that there's interest from other clubs in Alvarez purely because he's not playing. And from what I've heard, City don't want to give up Alvarez unless he specifically comes out and says, I want to leave. Now, he's not done that yet, so his situation's a bit up in the air. And in terms of teams that he might go to, Arsenal's potentially one. We've seen Manchester City players go there in the past, notably Gabriel Jesus and Alexander Zinchenko. But I don't think City are really realistically going to want to sell him to Arsenal, given that they're clearly their closest rivals in the Premier League. So I think it'd be a very difficult deal to get done. We've seen Chelsea are interested in him too. Again, it's a difficult one to get done for them because of the financial aspect of it. They're labouring a little bit in terms of raising money to sign players because of financial fair play. And obviously don't have Champions League football as well. So I think it'd be very surprising if he was to move elsewhere in the Premier League, and I would say that PSG are clear favourites in this one.
And we've heard that Erling Haaland he hasn't fully committed to Manchester City long term. You would think that City would want to hold on to a player like Alvarez just as an insurance policy in case Haaland moves on. So you had written about that in your first piece for us, and I thought that was interesting. And then the whole story blew up. So definitely a transfer rumor to keep your eye on. I think he would take some minutes away from Gonzalo Ramos, so I don't love the move from that aspect, but you can't deny his quality. I think would be a great signing for PSG. Let's keep moving to more transfer news. João Neves over at Benfica. Simple question. Do you think that he leaves Benfica this summer? I think that the club has been reported they want somewhere north of 100 million euro for him. I saw another report that PSG may be able to send some players, like Carlos Soler, for example, or Renato Sanchez. Maybe they could send two players there to kind of lower that transfer fee. But what are you hearing in terms of João Neves?
Well, you say it's a simple question, but the answer is much more complicated, unfortunately, as so often these things are. So you're exactly right. The Benfica's asking price, they have set it at over 100 million. His release fee is 120 million, which is clearly massive. I mean, he's a player who's exploded onto the scene, but has he done enough to justify that sort of fee? Probably not. We've seen interest from England already. Manchester United and Arsenal have both been linked with a move for him, but these clubs are only willing to pay 50 or 60 million euros, which is a huge shortfall in terms of what Benfica want. However, Benfica are trying to negotiate a new contract with him, but this is also proving to be complicated. They've offered him a deal which was described in Ebola, which is a Portuguese paper, the Portuguese equivalent of L'Equipe, if you like. It was incomparable to the other high earners. So he's unhappy with this. He's unhappy with Benfica because he's not getting the contract he wants. He feels undervalued there, and he's only on a contract at the moment which is reportedly at €500,000 per year. So that's a tiny contract in terms of his wages. So it's easy to see that he would be attracted elsewhere in terms of wages and potentially prestige as well. Throw this into the mix as well. Benfica also need to make sales for financial reasons. They had hoped to sell Antonio Silva, who's a promising young centre-back, but he's not attracting the interest that he was in the first half of the season. So the whole situation with him is really complicated. Benfica obviously don't want to sell, but there's issues elsewhere that could force them at least to drop their asking price, which could spark a bidding war. It'll be an interesting one to watch as the summer develops, for sure.
I do wonder if he's also looking at the development of Vitinha, especially Portugal player coming into PSG. You could argue he's maybe one of the top 5 midfielders. He was man of the match in Portugal's first match in the Euros. Is he looking at him and thinking, I could follow that same trajectory? Look at Nuno Mendes, how he's progressed. Now we know he had the injury, but again, before that injury, even now, you could say he's one of the top left backs. So is he looking at PSG's success with these Portuguese players and thinking maybe that would be a good place for me? I can get paid and develop, play in the Champions League. Everything he wants is at PSG, it seems like.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like you mentioned, Vitinha has been not just one of the best midfielders at PSG, but probably one of the best midfielders in the Champions League last season. He's really grown into the team and looks outstanding. Equally, on the other hand, you've got Gonçalo Ramos, who's perhaps not done as well as he might have expected. But equally, there was the Kylian Mbappé factor there as well. So that's a little bit complicated. But for sure, PSG's reputation in Portugal has to be strong because of the development that these players that you mentioned have done over the course of the last year, particularly.
Let's move to a potential outgoing player. There's been a lot of rumor swirling around Achraf Hakimi, PSG's right back. We know how him and Kylian Mbappé were best of friends at PSG. They're really close. Hakimi's got a couple years left on his contract. Do you see a world where Hakimi follows Mbappe to Real Madrid? We know that's where he came up through their youth ranks there. Does he go to Real Madrid to rejoin his friend Kylian Mbappe there and maybe finish out his career there? What are you thinking about with Hakimi? Does he leave PSG? And should PSG be preparing for that? Finding a starting right back that they could bring in, and that way, if he does leave, they have a replacement ready to go.
Yeah, I think for sure there's a prospect of Hakimi going back to Real Madrid. We know Dani Carvajal's only got a year left on his contract there, and he is 32, so he's probably not somebody that they're going to be looking at in the long term to be their right back. Hakimi, as you mentioned, he's only 25. He spent a long time in the Real Madrid youth setup. He's reportedly a Real Madrid fan. And obviously you've got the Kylian Mbappe factor thrown in there as well. So there's so much that could potentially draw Hakimi back to Real Madrid. Equally, I don't see it happening this summer because PSG are just going to be so busy in the transfer market. Do they really want to give themselves another problem at right back in terms of finding another starting right back who can replace Hakimi? I think that's a complicated one from a PSG perspective. From Real Madrid, equally, as you mentioned, Hakimi has 2 years left on his contract. In a year's time, he's going to be much easier to sign. He's probably going to be a bit cheaper. I just see that Real Madrid holding out for another year and seeing if they can get him for a little bit of a smaller transfer fee. And there was reports in Spain as well that they're not just looking at Hakimi, they're also looking at Reece James at Chelsea to sign next year. We know that Real Madrid only like to sign one Galactico a summer, so it's Mbappe this summer, but it could be Alphonso Davies next summer, and Davies is who would arrive on a free transfer, much in the way that Mbappe did this year. And obviously being free, it would potentially free up funds to sign Hakimi instead. So I think we can see Hakimi going to Real Madrid for sure, but will it be this summer? I don't think so. I think he's got another year left at PSG.
Just kind of a surprise question. We didn't have this in the rundown, but I was wondering, you mentioned with Real Madrid, do you think there's any, I don't know, I'll use the word collusion, but do you think this is a set out strategy? We want to sign players on free transfers because it gives us a lot more flexibility financially. I guess there's nothing wrong with that, but if they're tapping up players, so if they were in talks with Mbappe, a season and a half ago saying, hey, run out your contract and we'll sign you. I mean, I don't know if that's against any kind of rules, but do you think that this is a strategy that Real Madrid are using to strengthen their squad, is to tap players, tell them we're going to sign you, but run out your contract and then come over?
Well, clubs aren't allowed to speak to players before the six months of their contract's up. So for sure, officially, it's not something that they can do. But unofficially, who knows what goes on behind closed doors. Manchester City, I'll use an example, like to use their players to encourage others to move to their team. And there's nothing wrong with that, of course, because it's just a player speaking to another player and saying, hey, come and join me at Manchester City. I know they've used Bernardo Silva to do that for Portuguese players, for example. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's absolutely fine. It's totally within the laws. I guess it's just a case of don't hate the player, hate the game. It's that sort of situation. It's just part of the game, and
there's all these intermediaries. So I guess that's a way that they can get around it.
Yeah, from Real Madrid's perspective, it's just smart business, and you can't blame them for that. And they certainly won't be the only club doing that, and it just makes sense for these teams.
Absolutely. And just to finish up the Hakimi conversation, Nordi Mukiele is another player. He's sort of seen as the backup right back, and he's been rumored to maybe go to Bayern Munich. And so I really feel like for PSG, that right back position is so weak right now. And then in a season, if you're thinking, hey, we're going to lose Hakimi, you really need to start identifying, maybe do a little bit like Real Madrid, start identifying those players maybe that you like, who can come in and start for you, that are maybe coming to the end of their contract, and see if you can get them on a free transfer, because that is certainly a position that needs to be upgraded.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've seen Real Madrid work really smartly in terms of their planning. As I mentioned, they only like to sign one big signing a summer, but they can afford to do this because their planning is so effective. So they do get their big star. Their team does improve, but there's also this gradual turnover of players that maybe other big teams don't necessarily have. But that is one of the reasons why Real Madrid are so effective, I think, because there's never any sort of huge transition period. And I think it's something that PSG could learn from. But equally, you need a strong base to start with from the beginning too. So it is tricky, but Real Madrid seem to have perfected it.
Yeah, they never really have like a down period like we're seeing with Manchester United right now, and Chelsea, this kind of like lull period where they're trying to sort things out and recycling managers.
Yeah, for sure.
I hate to say it, they've got it all figured out. Let's talk about Lenny Euro, because he is obviously PSG's first choice center back. It's a position they need to upgrade, and Lenny Euro at Lille, that's the guy. But like so many we just talked about, he's sort of lured by the white shirt of Real Madrid, and so it's thought that Lenny Euro, he prefers to make that move to Real Madrid. So if we set him aside and say, okay, PSG are not going to be able to sign him, are there other center back targets that PSG should be looking at as a backup plan? I'll throw a name, Kevin Danso, Austria. Maybe he plays at Lens, and he just actually broke Kylian Mbappe's nose at the Euros. Is that a player maybe PSG should be looking at?
Yeah, he's actually one of the guys that I've got noted down on my list here. He was definitely somebody that I think would do really well at PSG. Equally, I think he would do well in the Premier League, because he's built like an absolute unit. He's a leader in defence, and he's got two strong campaigns under his belt in Ligue 1. So for sure, he's one guy. In terms of other players that I've got noted down, PSG were interested in Chelsea's Levi Colwill for a while. Bayern have tried to bid for him. They got emphatically knocked back. But I think it's worth PSG keeping a note on him, purely because of, as I mentioned earlier, Chelsea's financial issues. They could be drawn into a sale at some point. Colwill's probably going to be overpriced, but he's worth keeping an eye on for sure, because he's such a wildly talented player. Equally, I've got Marguerite of Crystal Palace down. He's liable to be sold this summer. He's attracting quite a bit of interest from Premier League clubs. An England international, again, because he's an England international, it's probably going to push the price up more than you would want. But again, a very talented player, only 23, so he fits the sort of profile that PSG are trying to sign at the moment. And another, perhaps a bit of a more outside bet, is Ronald Araujo at Real Madrid. Pardon me, Barcelona, of course. You know, it was only a year ago that he was getting touted as the best centre back in the world. Fell out with Xavi, and all of a sudden his stock's fallen dramatically. So he's had issues at Barcelona. Of course, Hansi Flick has come in there and changed it, or will change things up. But he's certainly somebody at 25 years old, Uruguay international. He's worth looking at as well.
I guess if we assume that Marquinhos stays for another season, he's probably going to be a starting center back for PSG. It's hard to imagine he would go to the bench. But do you see PSG needing to sign a center back who will be an immediate starter? Or do you think Skriniar or Beraldo, do you think a player like that can make that jump to be a regular starter?
Yeah, I'm not hot on Skriniar. I think he really struggled in his first season really badly. It just doesn't look like a good fit. It doesn't look like something that's going to work. And I would suggest he's probably somebody that's going to need moved on. Similarly, Beraldo has obviously come in the last 6 months of the season, thrown into a starting position very regularly, looked a little bit out of his depth, in my opinion, to begin with. And I think it would be too much to expect him to come into a team and continue being or to start to being successful in next season. So for me, he's a backup option, a strong backup option, and certainly one for the future. But I think if PSG want to hit the heights that the club and the fans aspire to, I think they probably need to find a starting centre back. Yeah.
And of course, we don't know about Presnel Kimpembe coming back from that Achilles injury. Seems like PSG have a lot of second and third options, some decent depth. But yeah, PSG need to sign Eleni Euro, Kevin Danso, someone who's experienced and has a lot of quality. So we'll have to keep an eye on that one. Some good options there from you.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
what I would say about Euro, sorry, is that
Yeah.
again, he's perhaps one for the future. So maybe not one that you'd expect to come in and be a leader in the Champions League, but definitely a good option to have. Danso, on the other hand, I think can come in and hit the ground running a little bit more. So for me, he would, if you're looking for somebody purely for next season, he would be the option. But if you're looking for somebody 3, 5, even 10 years down the line, then you go Euro.
And it's just kind of funny. PSG lose Mbappe and Danzo breaks his nose and then PSG signs him. I kind of like that storyline. I could write about that. That's fun.
Yeah, it's a nice narrative, isn't it?
Let's go to the Euros here because Vitinha and surprisingly Fabian Ruiz, I didn't have that on my bingo card. Those two have picked up man of the match performances in the opening match for their respective countries. With the injury to Mbappe, I believe the reports are he's going to miss France's next match. So with that being said, do you think Bradley Barcola, does he now have a chance to have a breakout performance, or is it Colomwani who would step in? Do you think he'll have a breakout performance with France now that Mbappe is out, maybe for multiple matches? What are you seeing? What do you think could happen with Barcola and Colomwani?
I think Didier Deschamps is a relatively conservative manager. I don't think he's going to take too many risks. So for that reason, I think he's going to pick Kolo Muani. However, I would pick Barcola. I'm a huge Bradley Barcola fan, as you'll probably find out over the next few weeks. Um, there's no guarantees with him. That's the trouble. He's still not. He's still only 21 years old. He's still not hugely consistent. And I think Deschamps will probably look at the way that Barcola started at PSG and perhaps reflect that he can't afford him to start so slowly with the national team as well, particularly in a European Championships finals. Obviously, it took him several months to settle properly. He got a few bad breaks in the beginning, but it certainly took him a few months to really find his top level at PSG. And he's only been given 2 caps. He's only got 37 minutes of international football experience. So I think it's going to be difficult for him to step into the team, particularly against the Netherlands, which France will see as a big game for them. So I think he's going to go with the slightly more experienced Kolo Muani, despite the fact that he's perhaps not as good an option. But there you go. That's Deschamps for you, and it's worked for France. To be fair to him, and I guess you can't really quibble with that.
Well, you say he's a little bit more conservative. Anyone who watched PSG this season would probably say that starting Colomwani is the more risky option over starting Barcola, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I mean conservative just in terms of he's been there before, he's done it for Deschamps before, then not necessarily that, he's the form player. I guess Deschamps a little bit like Gareth Southgate, and that maybe he doesn't have his favourites, but he likes to stick with what he's tried before and what's worked before.
And I'm a huge Barcola fan as well. Are you worried a little bit, say, Kvaratskhelia comes in, kind of stunting Barcola's growth there on the left side? Now that Mbappe's gone, it seemed to be Barcola's position, but PSG seemed to be looking at players who could come in and challenging him, and maybe that's a good thing, or maybe it turns out to be a not so good thing because he's not getting the playing time.
Yeah, for sure. I would have preferred PSG to pick up somebody who is maybe a little bit more versatile than Kvaratskhelia, because from what I've seen of Kvaratskhelia, he's a pure left winger. I know he's played as a second striker for the national team a few times, but that doesn't seem to be his main position. And obviously, Barcola, again, is a pure left winger. He's featured best out there. So, yeah, I think it's going to be one that's it definitely stands on his toes to some extent and isn't necessarily the best move for Barcola. But equally, I think with a lot of young players, I think if a big club is patient with them, manages their game time, I think it's optimal for them not to be playing every single match. Maybe play 1.5 games out of four or something like that. So I think it could be good, but I would like to see Barcola get a little bit more game time than he's likely to get if PSG spend big money, particularly in Kvaratskhelia, because if they spend €100 million, even 80 or 90 million euros, the pressure is going to be on Lucho to start Kvaratskhelia.
And we've seen over the years PSG just messed up the young talent they've had come through the squad. I'd hate for them to waste Barcola and he feels like he's got to move on to another club because he's not getting the opportunity that he thought he would get, and he certainly earned it. So hopefully PSG can do the right thing and make sure that he's getting the playing time he needs. We've got one more question for you, and we've got to end with a bit of a prediction because your first column for us, you wrote about Julian Alvarez and potentially being a good fit at PSG, and then literally the next day, the news broke that the club was interested in signing him. So everyone's following you. So I need you to make another prediction here. Do you have another player that you think would be a good fit at PSG but isn't currently being linked at the moment?
Oh, there's no pressure in this one, is there? Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to top that Alvarez prediction. I don't think. I mean, Danso would be the player for me. I mean, I know there's been sort of tentative links in the past. He was linked with them in January to some extent, but I've not seen really very much heat about it in the summer. So he's one that I would say, particularly if he does well for Austria in the European Championships, and I think Austria will do well. I think they're a dark horse that I've tipped to do well. And obviously they started quite well against France, so I can see him getting tipped for a move to PSG and also several Premier League clubs, I would imagine.
Yeah, and Austria up next. They've got Poland, and then they wrap up with Netherlands. So two difficult matches for them. We'll see if Danso and his team can advance to the next round of the Euros. That'll be exciting. That's all the questions I have for you, but I know that we were talking before we recorded, and you have a new column that you're working on for us. You want to preview it a little bit for the folks listening, and then they can go and read it over on Substack?
Yeah, for sure. I'm going to be writing about Xavi Simons, who is, just about the hottest topic at the moment in the football transfer news because he's being linked with so many clubs, and his situation's a really interesting one because there's so many teams want him. What's going to happen with PSG? Red Bull Leipzig or RB Leipzig want him. What's going to happen there? There's so many interesting possibilities for him, but equally, who can PSG bring in that's going to do a similar job to him? Because he's a really unique player, but with his versatility and his skill set. So I'm going to be looking at the players that PSG could potentially sign, and also where Xavi Simons will end up come the start of the season, because it doesn't look like it's going to be Paris.
Yeah, unfortunately, and I'm still holding out for a Benjamin Sesko, Xavi Simons kind of swap deal between Leipzig and PSG. I got my fingers crossed. It's not very likely, but it would be nice to get a player of that quality back if you're losing a player like Xavi Simons. So looking forward to reading that piece. We'll have it in the coming days, so make sure you go over and subscribe to Substack so you don't miss that. Robin, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. One last thing, tell everyone how they can find you on Twitter if they want to interact with you.
Yeah, for sure. You can get me on Twitter at rbairner. That's RBAIRNER. And I look forward to having some chats with you and getting to know you all.
Fantastic. Thanks again for coming on. And thank you all out there for listening. Really appreciate it. And we'll catch you next time. Bye, everyone.